This morning we continue our summer sermon series on superheroes, and today's focus is on Spider-Man. Now, Spider-Man is the one comic book character whose comics I've actually read, because they used to be in the comics section in the newspaper. Anyone remember that? I see a couple nods. Growing up, we got the local newspaper delivered every morning, and while my parents read pretty much the whole paper, from late elementary school on, I would read two sections: the sports page, to find out the baseball scores from the night before, and the comics. And I'm not quite sure what drew my eye to Spider-Man, along with Peanuts and Garfield and Family Circus, but it became one of the comics that I read on a regular basis. And I remember noticing the difference in the Sunday paper when you learned that Mary Jane, Peter Parker's girlfriend and then wife, is a redhead, because you don't notice that in the weekday paper. I also remember the first live-action movie that came out in 2002, because I went to see it with a guy who's tall and skinny. And his comment was that he liked Spider-Man, because the hero isn't a muscular, chiseled, super handsome guy, but instead a scrawny kid with acne. And that was actually the main distinguishing mark between Spider-Man and all the superheroes who came before him. When Stan Lee and Steve Ditko first floated the idea for Spider-Man to their editor, their boss initially shot them down for three reasons. One was that Peter Parker was a teenager, and teenagers had never been the main character in a comic book before. They'd only ever been a sidekick. Two was the problem with spiders. Most people don't really like spiders. Anyone here actually loves spiders? Yeah, right, that was the problem. And the third problem was that Peter Parker was created to be this scrawny, pimply, nerdy high school student who doesn't know how to talk to girls. And their editor said, "Don't you understand what a hero is?" Eventually, they got the go-ahead to go with it. And Spider-Man was such a huge success that he became the comic books company's flagship character. And the reason for Spider-Man's success was two of those three reasons that the editor didn't think the concept would work. First, in 1962, more and more teenagers were reading comic books for the first time, more than ever before. Previously, it had been more of an adult market. And even the comic book that Spider-Man was published in, Amazing Adult Fantasy, was renamed when Spider-Man was added to become Amazing Fantasy. So the authors actually had a good idea of their audience. And then second, teenagers and adults liked Peter Parker because he was someone they could relate to. He isn't godlike like Superman. Instead, he actually works, has an after-school job to help his Aunt May pay the bills, like some teenagers do. He was the first superhero who had flaws and personal problems. He doesn't have it all together. What was original about Spider-Man wasn't his superpowers, but the fact that his real identity was this nerdy high school student. And because of that, people like the guy I saw the movie with could identify with him. Spider-Man was the first flawed superhero with everyday problems. Now, part of the flaws you see is that he doesn't know what to do with his superpowers when he first gets them. Unlike other superheroes, he isn't born with his powers, he doesn't create them or invent them, and he doesn't choose them. In stark contrast, his superpowers are thrust upon him. Peter is bit by a radioactive spider, and all of a sudden, he can do amazing things. And at first, he does not use his powers wisely. In the movie we gathered to watch this past week, the first thing he does is set out to take vengeance on the high school jock who beat him up. He shows up on the basketball court, flaunts his powers, and gets payback. As Christians, we know that God says, "Vengeance is mine," and we are not to seek revenge. God will take care of that for us. Instead, Jesus says, if someone strikes you on the cheek, we are to turn the other cheek. And if someone takes your shirt, we are to offer them our coat. We don't repay evil with evil, but we respond to evil with a blessing. Or for a third Bible quote from Romans, Paul writes, "Do not repay anyone evil for evil. Be careful to do what is right in the eyes of everyone. Beloved, never avenge yourselves, but leave room for God. It is written, 'Revenge belongs to me, and I will pay it back,' says the Lord. Instead, if your enemy is hungry, feed him. If he is thirsty, give him a drink. For by doing this, you will heap burning coals on his head. Do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good." So in case you're also bit by a radioactive spider, just keep that in mind. Peter's initial response reminds me also of lottery winners who spend all their cash and then a few years later have to declare bankruptcy. It's not uncommon for lottery winners to end up with even less than they had before their windfall. And sometimes they end up with nothing at all because they flaunt it all, show it off, and then blow it all. It's common also among professional athletes when they get that first big signing bonus to spend all the money freely. And then something like an injury happens and they can't play anymore. They end up broke as well. These pro athletes and lottery winners act irresponsibly and then they have nothing left. In the Bible, Jesus tells the story of the prodigal son who takes his half of his inheritance and then blows it traveling and partying and doing what he wants. Being irresponsible is a good way to go broke. Peter doesn't go broke, but he does lose his Uncle Ben. Peter is an orphan being raised by his aunt and uncle, and one of those early nights when he first gets his powers, he sees a robber running away. And Peter decides he doesn't need to stop him. He can just let him go. Later in that getaway, the robber runs into Peter's uncle and ends up killing him. And Peter realizes this later and realizes he could have prevented this if he had acted wisely and maturely. The last panel of that first Spiderman comic had the quote that Uncle Ben says in the movie, "With great power comes great responsibility." Put a different way in our gospel this morning, from everyone to whom much has been given, much will be required. And from the one to whom much has been entrusted, even more will be demanded. Jesus said it after relating a story about responsible and irresponsible servants. To whom much has been given, much will be required. It's a hard thing to hear. And what are you doing with what you've been given? It's like another parable that Jesus tells, the one about the talents or the bags of gold. The master gives them out to his servants before going on a trip, and when he comes back, he wants to see what the servants have done with the money that they were given. 2 servants invested it and used it wisely and earned even more money. And the 3rd servant buried the money in the ground, so that at the end, all he had to show was the exact same gift he'd been given at the beginning. The master's a little frustrated and says, "You could have at least put it in the bank where it would have earned interest." And he's extremely displeased. He takes away the money from the 3rd servant and throws him out. To whom much has been given, much will be required. What are you doing with what you've been given? Now, it may be that you don't like the responsibility you've been given. You don't want it. It's uncomfortable. It's not what you would have chosen for yourself. It's not the hand you would have dealt yourself. It may even be literally painful. Some responsibilities are joys to carry out. Others feel more like crosses to bear, and you chafe at having to carry it. Why, God, do I have to be the one to do this? Couldn't you have asked someone else? Why me? Please ask someone else, God. I don't want to. I can't. Peter Parker isn't really sure he wants his superpowers, at least not all the time. And as you heard in our Old Testament reading this morning, Moses certainly does not want to be chosen. He did not have his hand up for God to call on him. He was probably sitting on his hands under his butt. What we read this morning was the end of the conversation between God and Moses at the burning bush, where God calls Moses and tells him he's going to set his people free. And Moses says, "No, thank you. You can call someone else to lead them." Moses has a whole list of excuses. The people won't listen to him. He can't speak well. Who is he to lead the people? Moses actually tells God no and says, "Please send someone else." He'd rather continue on with his life as usual. He'd rather not do the hard work. It's not a very exciting life that he has. It's under slavery, but it's certainly safer than risking it all and completely changing his life. Moses is quite worried about the risks. But it's God who is calling and God who is giving him this responsibility. To whom much has been given, much will be required. And Moses knew that. He knew it would be hard. He knew it would be a cross to carry, leading the people out of Egypt away from the powerful Pharaoh who provided everything for them, and out into the wilderness, and who knew what God had in store for them after that. He knew it was going to be a huge responsibility, and so he tried to say no. However, God's call is compelling, as we talked about last week, And eventually Moses agrees to do what God asks him to do. What are you doing with what you've been given? Are you trying to bury it in the sand like the one servant? Are you flaunting it and showing it off like Spiderman first did? Or do you try to do your best and use it wisely? And there may be some trial and error, and that's okay. Don't be flippant and arrogant about your responsibilities. And at the same time, don't do someone else's job either. We're not all called to do the same tasks. We're not all called to sing in the choir or be a trustee or even mow the lawn. We have different gifts and graces, and God calls us to use them as we've been giving them. If you haven't been given a beautiful singing voice, I don't expect you up here with the choir, although I know you'd certainly be welcome, right, Miss Edie?
Yes.
We are to use and be responsible with the gifts that we have been given. Figure out where your gifts and passions meet the needs of our community. We're not all called to the same thing, and that's okay. And some of these gifts that we have, we'd rather not have. And yet when we figure out how to use them for God's service, then they can become something that we enjoy and appreciate. Peter Parker didn't really want his superpowers. It wasn't his choice to have them. He had to instead come to accept them and figure out how to work with them. And eventually he came to embrace them and the responsibility that came with having those powers. I think symbolic of that acceptance was when he designed his own costume, his suit with the mask and the spider, of course, on the chest. He had to learn to accept his powers because they weren't going away. He had to learn to use them responsibly, fix his past mistakes, ask forgiveness where it was appropriate. His powers did change his identity. And it may be that your new responsibilities change yours as well. You can grieve the old if you need to. Grieve what no longer is. But don't stay there. As the 23rd Psalm says, we walk through the valley of the shadow of death. We don't pitch a tent or build a house there. New responsibilities, new roles can be hard to adjust to. They can feel like a cross to bear. And yet Jesus says, take up your cross and follow me. If you need help perhaps making shoulder pads for your cross to rest on, or web slingers to go with your new responsibilities, or a mask to help you carry it better, let us know. We are here to help and to pray with you and to walk with you. It's your responsibility, and yet you are not alone in this journey. Thanks be to God. Amen.